It was a Monday morning, March 3rd, 2025, the kind of Monday that felt heavier than most, not because anything bad had happened yet, but because it was early spring in Marshalltown, Iowa, and the cold hadn't quite decided whether it was leaving or staying. And inside Patterson John Deere, the fluorescent lights were already buzzing while coffee cups sat, half-finished on desks, and Rick Patterson was exactly where he'd been for most of the last 32 years. Behind the financing desk, skimming numbers on a screen he could practically read in his sleep, when the door opened and in walked a man Rick didn't recognize, which in itself was rare, because when you've sold tractors in the same town for 3 decades, you tend to know every face. That matters. Every farmer who farms big, every farmer who farms small, every man who walks in with purpose, and every man who walks in just to kill time. And this man looked like none of the ones Rick usually paid attention to. He wore Carhartt overalls that had been washed so many times they'd lost their original color, stained with grease and dirt that had soaked in permanently. His boots were heavy with dried mud, the kind that told you he'd walked across real ground that morning, not concrete. And on his head was a faded seed company cap that Rick hadn't seen sold new since the 1990s, the brim curved just enough to show it had been worn, not styled. And he stood there for a moment near the showroom tractors, not admiring them the way buyers usually did, but simply looking, like someone glancing at old tools they already understood. And Rick noticed, almost subconsciously, the way the man's shoulders sat, relaxed but not careless, the posture of someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone in the room. And Rick would later remember that detail, because at the time it meant nothing to him at all. The man walked past the million-dollar machines without stopping and made his way toward the desk. And Rick looked up, already forming the mental category he'd placed this guy into: small operator, probably south of town, maybe renting ground, maybe struggling, the kind of customer who usually came in asking about used equipment or financing extensions. And Rick straightened slightly, not out of respect, but out of habit. And the man stopped at the desk, rested his hands lightly on the counter, and said calmly, without any preamble or apology, "I just want to check my balance." And for a split second Rick thought he'd misheard him, because that wasn't a sentence people said here, not like that, not without context. And then it registered fully, and Rick laughed, actually laughed out loud. A short reflexive sound that escaped before he could stop it, not because he meant to be cruel, but because the statement struck him as absurd in this setting. Like someone asking for a hotel room in a grocery store. And Rick had heard a lot of strange questions in his career, but this one caught him off guard, and the man didn't flinch, didn't bristle, didn't smile. He just stood there, patient, like he had nowhere else to be. And Rick waved his hand slightly and said, "Sir, if you're looking to apply for equipment financing, I can help you with that. What are you thinking of purchasing?" And the man shook his head once, slow and deliberate, and said, "No, I'm not looking for financing. I just want to check my account balance." And now Rick was confused, because there was no account balance to check at a dealership. There were loans, there were credit lines, there were outstanding balances owed, but not accounts in the way the man seemed to mean it. And Rick leaned back slightly in his chair, his smile tightening, and said, "We don't have customer accounts here. This isn't a bank." And the man nodded like he already knew that, like Rick was just confirming something obvious, and said, "I know, but I have an account with you. I want to see the balance." And Rick felt the shift then, the moment where irritation replaced amusement, because now it sounded like the man didn't understand how any of this worked. And Rick prided himself on patience, but he also prided himself on efficiency. And he said, "Okay, what's your name?" assuming this was going to turn into a quick lookup of an old loan, maybe a payoff request, something he'd handled thousands of times before. And the man said, "Bill Henderson." And Rick turned to the computer, typed the name in, waited a beat, frowned slightly, hit enter again, checked spelling, ran another search, and said, "I don't see any active financing under that name. When did you purchase equipment here?" And Bill shook his head again and said, "I didn't purchase anything." And Rick stopped typing and looked up, eyebrows raised now. "Then what exactly is it you think you have a balance on?" And Bill took a breath, not irritated, not embarrassed, just steady, and said, "I've been making deposits," and Rick blinked. "Deposits?" He repeated, and Bill nodded. "Deposits toward future equipment." And Rick let out a small breath through his nose, more confused than amused now. "We don't take deposits. We're not a bank." And Bill reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a worn leather folder, the kind that had been folded and unfolded so many times it no longer closed flat. And he placed it on the desk between them, gently, like it mattered, and said, "You do." And Rick hesitated for a second before opening it, because something in Bill's tone had changed the room, and inside were receipts, not one or two, but dozens, neatly stacked, edges yellowed with age. And Rick picked up the top one and read it. March 1996. Deposit $12,000 toward future equipment purchase. Patterson John Deere. And Rick's smile disappeared completely. He flipped to the next. June 1998. $8,500. September 2001. $15,000. April 2004. $22,000. And Rick felt his chest tighten as he kept flipping. November 2007. $31,000. February 2011. $28,000. August 2014. $35,000. May 2018. $42,000. January 2022. $48,000. September 2024. $52,000. And Rick stopped flipping and stared at the pile, his mind scrambling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed he knew about the man standing in front of him. And he looked up at Bill and said, slowly now, "You've been leaving money here for almost 30 years. And Bill nodded, yes, and Rick grabbed a calculator, fingers moving faster than he realized. And when the number appeared, his hands actually shook. $387,500, and Rick leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking from the screen to the man in the overalls, and said, "You know this money hasn't been earning any interest." And Bill nodded again, "I know." And Rick couldn't stop himself. "Why would you do that?" And Bill shrugged slightly, "Because I didn't want to spend it. If it was in my regular account, it was too easy to touch. Here it was out of sight." And Rick stared at him, because this wasn't how people talked about money anymore, not in 2025. And Rick turned back to the computer, digging deeper, searching old records, and there it was, a customer prepayment account. Bill Henderson, balance $387,500, untouched, sitting there quietly for decades. And Rick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, because this wasn't just unusual, it was unsettling. It meant that for nearly 30 years his dealership had been holding onto a small fortune for a man no one paid attention to. And Rick swallowed and asked, "Why are you checking this now?" And Bill said, "Simply because I'm ready to buy." And Rick laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "Buy what?" he asked, and Bill said, "New equipment. I'm 72. I've been farming 48 years. It's time." And Rick felt the room tilt slightly, like the ground shifting under him. And he pulled up inventory, doing what he knew how to do, anchoring himself in numbers, and asked what Bill needed. And Bill answered without hesitation, listing horsepower requirements like someone who had thought about this for a long time. And Rick calculated and spoke out loud, 3 tractors, 900,000, a combine, 720,000, a planter, 390,000, total to $1,110,000. And Rick looked up, expecting resistance, bargaining, financing questions, something. But Bill just nodded and said, "Okay." And Rick said, "You have 387,000 here." And Bill said, "I know." And Rick waited. And then Bill said, "I'll bring the rest tomorrow." And Rick felt his mouth open slightly. "You'll bring what?" And Bill said, "The rest, in cash." And the words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. And Rick finally found his voice. "You're saying you're going to bring $1.7 million in cash tomorrow?" And Bill looked at him, genuinely puzzled. "Is that a problem?" And Rick leaned back in his chair, heart pounding now, realizing that the man he had laughed at minutes earlier was about to make the largest cash purchase in the history of Patterson John Deere. And for the first time that morning, Rick Patterson felt something he hadn't felt in years, the uncomfortable sensation that he might have been completely wrong about someone, and that this story, whatever it was only just beginning. Rick Tried to play it cool after Bill said he'd bring the rest tomorrow. But the truth was his body didn't know how to act normal anymore. Not after hearing $1.7 million in cash, said with the same plain tone most people used to say they'd pick up milk on the way home. And for a moment he just stared at Bill Henderson like the man might suddenly laugh and admit it was some kind of joke. But Bill didn't smile, didn't wink, didn't give him that little look people give when they're exaggerating. He just waited, hands still resting on the counter, patient in that steady way that made Rick feel like the one who was performing, not the farmer. Rick cleared his throat, glanced down at the numbers again, almost hoping he'd typed something wrong, but the total was still there, $2,110,000, and the customer prepayment account still showed $387,500. Rick said, "Mr. Henderson." "Bill, I'm sorry. I need to ask, when you say cash, you mean a cashier's check, wire transfer, something like that?" Bill's brow creased slightly, like Rick was making it complicated on purpose. "No," Bill said. "I mean cash." Rick felt his stomach drop, and his mind jumped straight to all the practical problems he'd never had to think about because nobody walked into a John Deere dealership and dropped 7 figures in paper bills, and Rick heard himself asking, "And you're bringing it here tomorrow," like repeating it would make it easier to believe. Bill nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. Rick's hands moved automatically to straighten the stack of receipts in the leather folder, as if tidying paper could tidy the situation. Then he slid the folder back toward Bill with both hands, careful, almost respectful now, and said, Okay, let's slow down for a second. I'm not saying no. I want to handle this the right way." Bill looked at him steadily. "That's fine," he said. "Handle it." Rick swallowed and forced himself to ask the question that had been burning since the moment he saw the deposits. "Why did you do it this way?" Bill didn't answer right away. He looked out across the showroom, past the glossy tractors, past the big banners and the promotional displays, toward the glass doors where customers came in all day long. And when he spoke, his voice was low, like he wasn't giving a speech. He was just telling the truth. "Because if it's easy to reach, it's easy to waste," Bill said. "I'm not smarter than anyone. I just know myself. If I can see it, I can spend it. If it's somewhere inconvenient, I leave it alone." Rick tried not to react, but that line hit him harder than he expected, because he'd spent his entire career making money easy to reach for other people, new equipment, easy payments, low monthly, sign here, drive at home, and here was a man who had built his whole life around making spending inconvenient. Rick said, carefully, "But you knew we don't pay interest." Bill nodded. "I didn't need interest." He said, "I needed discipline." Rick almost laughed again, but this time it would have been a laugh of disbelief mixed with something like admiration, and he caught it before it came out. Instead he asked, "So you've just been saving for this for decades?" Bill nodded. "I planned to buy when I needed it," he said, "not when someone told me I should." Rick leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk. "Okay," he said, "then help me understand. You've been making deposits since 1996. That's 29 years. Why now? Why all at once?" Bill's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, like Rick had finally asked the question that mattered. "Because I didn't need it earlier." Bill said, "My equipment still worked. It was old, but it worked. And new equipment doesn't grow more corn. It just grows payments." Rick felt a small jolt hearing that in his own showroom, in his own building, sitting in the air like a challenge. Rick had heard farmers complain about prices, complain about interest rates, complain about the manufacturer, but he hadn't heard someone say it that plainly, like a rule. Bill continued, "I kept it running, fixed what needed fixing, rebuilt what needed rebuilding. When it was still worth fixing, I fixed it. When it stopped being worth fixing, I saved. That's all." Rick glanced down at Bill's hands, rough and steady, and he tried to picture this man under a tractor in a cold shed at midnight, instead of signing financing forms under warm lights. And the picture made too much sense. Rick asked, "What are you farming?" Bill answered without hesitation, "Corn and soybeans," he said. Rick asked, "How many acres?" Bill said, "420. Rick blinked. 420, he repeated, almost offended on behalf of what he'd been taught modern farming was supposed to be. In Rick's world, the farmers who mattered were the ones with 3,000 acres, the ones buying new iron every few years, the ones who turned the lot over like a revolving door. 420 was small by today's standards, small enough that Rick had probably sold Bill a part once in a while, and never bothered to remember his name. And you've had the same acres this whole time? Rick asked. Bill nodded. Since 1977, he said. Never expanded. Rick sat back. Why not? Bill's mouth tightened for half a second, not angry, just firm. Because I didn't need to, he said. 420 is enough if you own it. Rick felt his chest tighten again, because the way Bill said own it made Rick think of the word debt, without Bill even having to say it. Rick tried to do the math in his head, because it was what he did when he didn't know what else to do. If Bill saved roughly $50, $0 a year on average for decades, on 420 acres, that meant he was running a tight operation, living lean, fixing instead of replacing. And Rick realized he had no idea how many of the farmers he sold to were actually making money, versus just moving money around with loans. Okay, Rick said. I'm going to ask something, and I'm not asking it to be rude. I'm asking because I need to understand what's happening. You're telling me you're bringing $1.7 million in cash from where? Bill answered like it was obvious. From my safe, he said. Rick stared. Your safe, he repeated. Bill nodded. At home, he said. Rick rubbed his forehead with his fingers. You keep that much cash at home? Bill's eyes narrowed slightly, not defensive. Just tired of people acting like his choices were unbelievable. Not all my money, he said. But enough. I don't trust one place with everything. I've got some in the bank. I've got some in investments. I've got cash. And I've got this account here. Rick heard himself exhale slowly, because the details were stacking up, and each one made Bill feel less like an impulsive old man and more like someone who'd planned his life with a patience Rick couldn't even relate to. Rick looked down at the order again and said, So you want 3 tractors, the combine, and the planter, as if repeating it would make it less surreal. Bill nodded. Rick said, You want the 8 are $370 for the big work, the 6 are $230 for the secondary, and the 5 are $125 as a utility. Bill said, That's right. Rick clicked through inventory, verified what they had coming, what could be sourced, what would take time, and you're set on the X9 1000 combine, Rick said. And Bill nodded. And the DB planter, Rick added. Bill nodded again. Rick paused. Delivery timelines, Rick said. This isn't like buying a pickup truck. Some of this we can schedule. Some of it we need to coordinate. Bill's face didn't change. Have it ready for delivery next week, he said, like he was ordering hay. Rick almost choked on that. Next week, he repeated. Bill nodded. I'm not asking you to build it from scratch, Bill said. I'm asking you to do your job. The line wasn't rude, but it hit like a reminder. Rick straightened in his chair. Okay, he said. Okay, we can make it happen, but if you're bringing cash tomorrow, Bill, I need to do this correctly. We'll have to notify our bank. We'll have to make sure we have a secure process. This isn't normal. Bill shrugged. It doesn't have to be normal, he said. It just has to be done. Rick held Bill's gaze, and something uncomfortable rose up in him. The memory of his laugh. The laugh had been quick, instinctive, harmless in his mind, but now it felt heavy, like it had exposed something ugly about him, how quickly he sorted people into categories based on what he saw. Rick swallowed and said, I owe you an apology. Bill didn't react. Rick continued anyway. I laughed when you said you wanted to check your balance, Rick said. I assumed the wrong thing. Bill's expression stayed steady, but his voice lowered. You assumed I was poor because I look poor, he said. Rick felt heat creep up his neck. He could have argued, could have tried to soften it, could have said it was a misunderstanding, but he couldn't because Bill was right, and the fact that Bill said it without anger made it worse. Rick nodded once. Yes, he admitted, that's what I did. Bill watched him for a second, then said, It happens all the time. Rick tried to speak, but Bill continued, People think wealth looks like a new truck and clean boots. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Rick looked down at Bill's boots, still caked in mud, and then back at the man's face. And he realized Bill wasn't trying to embarrass him. Bill was just naming a fact. Rick asked, quietly now, why keep the old truck? Bill didn't hesitate. Because it runs, he said. Because it's paid for. Because I don't need a new one. Rick nodded slowly, as if those simple reasons were foreign. Bill shifted his weight slightly. The first sign he was ready to leave. Rick hurried. One more question. Because he felt like if Bill walked out now, he'd lose the chance to understand something that might matter beyond this sale. If you've been this disciplined, Rick said, if you've been saving like this, why didn't you just buy new equipment earlier and make life easier on yourself? Bill's eyes flicked toward the showroom tractors again, then back to Rick. Because easy is expensive, Bill said. Because payments are a kind of stress you don't feel until you have them. Because I'd rather work harder than owe anyone. Rick sat there, absorbing that. And now? Rick asked. Now my old equipment is worn out, Bill said. Not old, worn out. Beyond reasonable repair. I'm 72. I can still farm. But I don't want to fight a breakdown every week. So I'm replacing everything at once, and I'm doing it cash. Because that's the whole point. No debt. Rick nodded, and he felt something in his chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Like part of him respected Bill and part of him was threatened by what Bill represented. Rick had built a life selling upgrades, selling the promise of easier, faster, newer. Bill had spent decades proving you could refuse that promise and still win. Rick glanced at the computer again, at the customer prepayment account with the exact balance sitting there, and he realized that somewhere in the back of this business, hidden under daily sales and monthly targets, Bill's quiet discipline had been sitting untouched like a loaded spring, waiting for the day it would snap into motion. Rick said, all right, and forced himself into professional mode. Tomorrow, you come in, we'll do this properly. I'll coordinate with the bank. We'll have security here. We'll verify everything and deposit it. We'll document it, and then we'll schedule delivery. Bill nodded once, satisfied. Good, he said, and he picked up the leather folder, tucking it back into his overalls like it was nothing more than a parts list. Rick stood, almost instinctively, even though he didn't stand for most customers, and that small detail didn't escape him. Bill turned to leave, and as he walked toward the doors, the mud on his boots leaving faint marks on the clean floor, Rick watched him pass the shiny tractors again without looking at them. And Rick found himself watching Bill's back, thinking about how many times he'd seen men walk out of this building with new equipment and fresh debt, smiling like they'd won something, and how this man was walking out with nothing new at all, looking the same as when he came in, except now Rick knew something about him that felt almost impossible. As the doors shut behind Bill and the showroom fell back into its normal hum, Rick sat down slowly, stared at the order total, then stared at the date on the screen, Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and thought, tomorrow is Tuesday. Tomorrow he says he'll come back. Tomorrow he says he'll bring cash. And Rick's mind ran through 1,000 questions that had nothing to do with equipment. What kind of man saves like that? What kind of life do you live to stack that kind of money without anyone noticing? And how many times had Rick Patterson looked at a customer and thought he knew the story just by looking at their truck? And now, with Bill Henderson's calm voice still hanging in the air, Rick reached for his phone. Because whether he believed it or not, he had to act like it was real. And the moment he started dialing his bank, he realized something else too. If Bill came back tomorrow with what he promised, it wouldn't just be the biggest sale in the dealership's history. It would be the kind of moment that rewired how Rick saw people forever. And that thought, more than the money, made his hands shake as the call connected. That night, long after the showroom lights were turned off and the tractors sat silent under the cold Iowa sky, Rick Patterson found himself unable to let go of the image of Bill Henderson, standing calmly at his desk, saying he'd bring $1.7 million in cash like it was an afterthought. And the more Rick tried to dismiss it as an anomaly, the more his mind kept circling back to a deeper question he hadn't asked out loud yet. Not really. which was how a man farming for 120 acres could quietly accumulate that kind of money without anyone noticing, because Rick had spent 32 years watching farmers chase size, chase speed, chase the appearance of success, and most of them were still calling him every season, asking about refinancing, and somewhere between staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation, Rick realized the only way Bill's story made sense was if it started decades earlier, long before deposits and receipts and showroom shock, back when Bill Henderson was just another young man, trying to get a foothold in a business that didn't forgive mistakes easily. And the truth was, Bill's story didn't begin with wealth at all. It began with pressure, because in 1977 Bill Henderson was 24 years old, newly married, working construction whenever he could, and desperate to buy a piece of land he could call his own, for 120 acres priced at $640 an acre, which even by the standards of the time wasn't cheap when you didn't come from money. And Bill scraped together $38,000 over 5 years of hard labor, early mornings and late nights, and put every dollar of it down, financing the rest at 8.9% over 20 years. A monthly payment that felt crushing the moment he signed the papers, and for the first decade, there was nothing romantic about it. No slow mornings, no peaceful sunsets. Just 80-hour weeks where Bill farmed during the growing season and took whatever construction work he could get during the winter, swinging hammers in the cold, hauling materials, doing side jobs for neighbors, because the land payment didn't care if the crops were good or bad. And every month that payment came due whether Bill felt ready or not. And in those early years, Bill's combined income hovered around $42,000, which sounds manageable until you subtract land payments, basic living expenses, and the constant repairs that come with running old equipment, because new equipment was never even a consideration. And Bill lived cheaper than anyone Rick had ever known, though. Rick wouldn't learn that until much later, because Bill didn't talk about it. He just did it, cutting costs down to the bone, no vacations, no eating out, no upgrades unless something broke beyond repair. And even then he fixed it himself whenever possible. And despite all that, Bill still saved a little every year, sometimes $8,000, sometimes a bit more. And every extra dollar went straight toward paying down the land faster, because to Bill, debt wasn't just a number, it was a weight. A kind of pressure that followed you to bed at night and sat with you when you woke up in the morning. And whenever Bill had a good year, whenever crops came in strong or construction paid a little extra, he didn't celebrate. He sent it to the bank, and by 1989, 12 years after buying that land, Bill Henderson owned all 420 acres free and clear at the age of 36. And that was the first real turning point of his life, though almost no one noticed it at the time, because once the land was paid off, the math changed completely. The same work suddenly produced surplus instead of survival, and Bill's farming income rose to around $48,000. Construction added another 16, and his living expenses stayed almost exactly the same, which meant for the first time in his life, Bill had real breathing room. And instead of expanding, instead of buying bigger equipment or more acres, like everyone around him expected, Bill did something that confused people. He stayed exactly where he was, because owning 420 acres outright felt better to him than owning twice as much land on paper. And Bill had lived through the farm crisis of the 1980s, watched neighbors lose land they'd worked their entire lives for, watched banks fail and promises evaporate. And that experience carved something deep into him, a quiet distrust of leverage and a deep respect for liquidity. And when Bill started saving in earnest, he didn't trust any single place to hold all of it, not because he was paranoid, but because he believed risk was real and diversification wasn't just for rich people. So he kept some cash at home in a safe, some money in banks, some in conservative investments later on. And starting in 1996, he began doing something that would eventually shock Rick Patterson to his core. He started making deposits at the John Deere dealership, not because it made financial sense on paper, because it didn't earn a dime in interest, but because it made psychological sense to Bill. Because once that money was there, it was gone from his daily life, inaccessible, inconvenient. and tied mentally to equipment he didn't yet need. And the first time Bill walked into Patterson John Deere with a deposit, Rick's father had been running the place, and even he had asked, "Why put money here, Bill? We don't pay interest." And Bill's answer had been simple and honest, "Because if it's here, I won't spend it. And someday I'll need equipment." And from that point on, every few years, after harvest, Bill would sit down at his kitchen table, run the numbers carefully, calculate his net profit, take exactly half of it, not most, not some, exactly half. And within days he'd drive into town and make another deposit, $12,000 one year, $8,000 the next, 15, 22, 31, 28, 35, 42, 48, 52. The amounts rising slowly as his operation became more efficient, but the behavior never changed. And people talked, because people always do. Farmers noticed Bill wasn't upgrading, wasn't expanding, wasn't chasing the same goals, and some thought he was foolish, others thought he was scared, and a few assumed he must not be doing very well. Because in a culture where success is often measured by what you show, Bill showed very little, and he didn't correct them, because Bill didn't need anyone else to agree with his system for it to work. And while his neighbors traded tractors every 7 to 10 years, financed new combines, and carried equipment payments year after year, Bill ran his machines until they were truly worn out, not inconvenient, not outdated, but finished, rebuilding engines, replacing transmissions, logging every repair cost and comparing it honestly to replacement cost. And the numbers always told him the same thing, that fixing was cheaper than financing. And over decades that difference compounded quietly, invisibly, because no one throws a party for money you didn't spend. And by the time Bill reached his late 60s, he had done something almost no one around him had managed to do. He had reached an age where farming was a choice, not an obligation. And that was the real reason he hadn't upgraded earlier, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he refused to trade long-term freedom for short-term comfort. And now, at 72, with his equipment finally worn beyond reasonable repair and his body less interested in constant breakdowns, Bill had decided it was time to cash in decades of discipline all at once. And when Rick Patterson tried to imagine that arc, tried to imagine saying no to easier options for nearly 50 years, he felt a kind of discomfort that had nothing to do with Bill's wealth and everything to do with his own choices, because Rick had made good money over his career, very good money, but he'd also spent it easily, upgrading his lifestyle the same way his customers upgraded their equipment, assuming tomorrow would always cover today. And Bill Henderson was standing there, quietly, as living proof that another path existed. A path that didn't look impressive along the way, didn't earn admiration or envy, but ended in something far rarer than either, control. And when Rick finally went to sleep that night, his last thought before drifting off wasn't about the sale or the commission or the logistics of handling that much cash. It was a simpler, heavier realization that wealth, real wealth, might have less to do with how much you make and more to do with how often you say no. And that idea, once planted, was already beginning to change how Rick Patterson saw his own reflection and the reflection of every farmer who had ever walked through his doors. Tuesday morning arrived colder than Monday, the kind of cold that made sound sharper and movement slower. And Rick Patterson was already at the dealership before sunrise, coffee untouched on his desk, staring at his phone like it might tell him whether Bill Henderson was about to walk through the door with $1.7 million in cash, or whether yesterday had been some kind of elaborate misunderstanding that would quietly resolve itself by noon. And the truth was, Rick didn't know which outcome made him more uneasy, because if Bill didn't come back, the story would fade into an odd anecdote, something he'd eventually laugh about. But if Bill did come back with what he promised, then something far larger than a sale was about to happen. And Rick had spent enough years in business to know that moments like that didn't just pass through your life without changing something permanently. And so Rick had done what he said he would do. He'd called the bank. He'd explained the situation in careful, measured terms that still sounded ridiculous even to his own ears. He'd arranged for armored transport protocols, for additional security, for counting procedures, And every person he spoke to had paused at least once and asked him to repeat the amount, and every time Rick repeated it, it sounded just as unreal as the first time. And by the time the rest of the staff began to arrive, word had already started to spread, not officially, not through announcements, but the way things always spread in small towns, through glances and lowered voices and raised eyebrows. And Rick could feel it in the building, that quiet hum of anticipation that had nothing to do with tractors. And when 10 o'clock came and went with no sign of Bill, Rick felt his chest tighten, because doubt is loudest right before it's proven wrong. And then at 10:17, the familiar sound of an old engine rolled into the parking lot. Not the smooth hum of a new pickup, but the unmistakable rattle of a well-used Dodge Ram. And Rick stood before he even realized he was standing, walked to the window, and watched as the same rust-eaten truck from the day before pulled into a spot near the entrance, and for a second nothing happened. And then the driver's door opened and Bill Henderson stepped out, wearing the same overalls, the same boots, the same faded cap. And Rick felt something close to relief wash over him, not because of the money, but because Bill had come back at all. And then Rick noticed something else. The passenger door opened, too, and a younger man stepped out, followed by another man in a suit, followed by a fourth who scanned the lot before closing the door. And then Rick saw the bags, 2 large duffel bags, heavy enough that Bill and the younger man each carried one with both hands. And the sight of those bags did something to the room, because even before the doors opened, even before anyone said a word, people understood money has a physical presence when it's real. And Rick felt his pulse in his ears as the doors opened. And Bill walked in, not hurried, not cautious, just steady. And Rick met him halfway this time. Hand extended, voice controlled but tight. "Morning, Bill." And Bill shook his hand firmly. "Morning," he said, and then gestured slightly toward the younger man. "This is my son." And then toward the man in the suit, "My accountant," and finally toward the last man. "And I hired security. Figured it was the smart thing to do." And Rick nodded, because suddenly nothing about this felt strange anymore. It felt methodical, planned. And Rick led them to a private office that had been prepared in advance, blinds drawn, bank representatives already present. And as the door closed behind them, the outside world faded away, replaced by the quiet seriousness of what was about to happen. And when Bill set the duffel bags on the table and unzipped the first one, Rick caught his breath despite himself, because there it was, hundreds and 50 stacked and banded, layer after layer, the kind of money you only ever see on screens or in movies. Except this was neither. It was tangible, imperfect, slightly worn, and Rick felt the weight of the moment settle fully on his shoulders as the counting began. Machines humming, hands moving carefully, the room filled with the sound of paper being verified. And no one spoke much, because there was nothing to say. And as the total climbed, Rick found himself watching Bill's face more than the numbers, expecting some sign of emotion, pride, satisfaction, something. But Bill looked the same as he had the day before, calm, focused, like this was simply the execution of a long-standing plan, not the culmination of a dramatic event. And when the final count was confirmed, and the numbers matched exactly what Bill had said they would, Rick felt something in him give way, because there was no more room for doubt, no room for reinterpretation. The story was real, the discipline was real, and the checkmarks on the forms Rick signed felt heavier than usual, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. And when everything was complete, when the money had been deposited and documented, and the order officially processed, Rick sat back in his chair and exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath for longer than he'd thought. And Bill stood, shook Rick's hand again, and said, "I appreciate you handling it properly." And Rick nodded, unable to find the words to explain what he was actually feeling, which was something closer to humility than he'd experienced in a long time. And as Bill and his son left the office, the door opened and the sound of the dealership rushed back in. Except now it was different, because people were looking, not openly, but enough. And Rick knew that by the end of the day, everyone would know what had happened. Not the exact details maybe, but enough to change the way they talked about Bill Henderson. And as Rick returned to his desk, the commission figure appeared on his screen. $15,525, the largest single commission of his career. And Rick stared at it without the rush he'd expected, because for the first time in his life, the money felt almost irrelevant compared to the lesson that had just unfolded in front of him. And over the next few days, that lesson began to ripple outward in ways Rick hadn't anticipated. Because word traveled fast, and farmers started talking, not just about the size of the purchase, but about the way it had been made. Cash, no. Financing, no leverage. And some were impressed, some were skeptical, some were defensive. And Rick began to notice something else too. The way he looked at his customers started to change, because he could no longer rely on the old shortcuts, the assumptions he'd made for decades based on trucks and clothes and acreage numbers. And when a farmer walked in asking about upgrades, Rick found himself asking different questions than he used to, not because a policy told him to, but because Bill Henderson's quiet presence had rewired his instincts. And at a staff meeting 2 weeks later, Rick stood in front of his sales team and told them the story from start to finish, not embellishing, not softening. And when he finished, the room was silent. And then one of the senior salesmen spoke up and said what Rick knew others were thinking. So what? We stopped pushing upgrades. We stopped financing. We sell less. And Rick nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, but we sell right. And there was pushback. There always is when you challenge a system that rewards speed and volume. And a few salesmen didn't like the new direction, didn't like being asked to understand customers instead of just closing them, and they left. But the ones who stayed started to notice something unexpected. Customers trusted them more. Conversations went deeper. Fewer deals fell apart later. Fewer farmers called in panic when prices dipped or payments came due. And Rick watched the numbers carefully because that's what he knew how to do. And by the end of the year, revenue was down slightly, but customer retention was up, bad debt was down, and for the first time in a long time, Rick felt like the business was built on something sturdier than constant motion. And personally, Rick couldn't escape the comparison that had lodged itself in his mind, because when he looked at Bill Henderson, he saw a man who had earned less than Rick over his lifetime, but kept far more of it. And that realization gnawed at him, because Rick had always thought of himself as successful, and by most measures he was. But success suddenly felt hollow when placed next to the kind of control Bill had achieved. And one evening, sitting at home, Rick added up his own numbers. Honestly, for the first time in years, income, spending, savings, and when he saw the result, he felt something close to embarrassment, not because he was broke, but because he wasn't nearly as secure as he'd assumed. And Bill Henderson, the farmer he'd laughed at, had quietly exposed a flaw in Rick's entire worldview. And that flaw wasn't about money, it was about discipline. And as the weeks passed, Rick realized the real impact of Bill's story wasn't the sale, or even the money. It was the mirror it held up to everyone who heard it. Because once you see that another way is possible, you can't unsee it. And that realization was already spreading far beyond the walls of Patterson John Deere, carried in conversations at diners, at co-ops, at kitchen tables, wherever farmers gathered and talked about the future. And Rick knew, even before the dust fully settled, that this wasn't the end of Bill Henderson's influence. It was only the moment people started paying attention. The months after Bill Henderson's purchase passed quietly on the surface, but underneath, something fundamental had shifted, not just inside Patterson John Deere, but in the way people talked, the way they listened, and the way they measured success. Because once the story got out, and it did get out despite no one ever officially announcing it, it became impossible to ignore. The guy with the rusty Dodge, the same one who wore worn-out overalls year after year, had walked into town and paid over $2 million cash for equipment without blinking. And for some people the story landed like inspiration. For others it landed like an accusation, because it forced a comparison no one had asked for. And Bill never went looking for attention. He kept farming the same way he always had, same acres, same routines, same habits, but people started watching him differently now, noticing things they had ignored before, like how he never complained about prices, how he never talked about debt, how he never seemed rushed or stressed. And a few younger farmers, Men and women under 35 who were already feeling the pressure of payments and expansion began reaching out to him quietly, not in public, not at meetings, but with phone calls and stops at the end of his driveway, asking questions they didn't feel safe asking anyone else. Questions like, how do you save when everything costs more every year? How do you compete without borrowing? How do you sleep at night when everyone says you have to grow or die? And Bill answered them the same way he answered everything else, plainly, without drama, without pretending it was easy, telling them he spent less than he made for decades, that he avoided debt because debt was a guaranteed cost, while savings were a delayed reward, that discipline wasn't exciting but it was reliable, and some listened and some didn't, because discipline has never been popular advice. And Rick Patterson watched all of this from a distance, aware now that the farmer he'd once laughed at had become a reference point, a quiet standard people compared themselves against whether they admitted it or not. And Rick noticed something else too, that Bill never once criticized anyone who lived differently, never told them they were wrong, never shamed them for their choices, which made his example even harder to dismiss, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't preachy, it just existed. And near the end of the year, Rick decided to ask Bill for something he'd never asked a customer before. He invited him to speak at a customer appreciation dinner. 80 farmers gathered in a rented hall, plates clinking, conversations overlapping, and when Rick first asked, Bill declined, said he wasn't a speaker, said he didn't have anything special to say. But Rick persisted, because he'd watched enough farmers drown quietly in debt to know they needed to hear something different, and eventually Bill agreed on the condition that he keep it short. And when the night came, Bill stood at the front of the room in the same clothes he always wore, no slides, no notes, no performance, and spoke for 15 minutes in the same calm tone he used everywhere else, telling them he wasn't smarter than anyone in the room, that he hadn't gotten lucky, that he'd simply decided early on that debt felt like a form of slavery and savings felt like freedom, and he chose freedom, even though it took 48 years and required giving up things he wanted now for things he needed later. And when he finished, the room was silent for a moment before applause filled the space, not because Bill had entertained them, but because he'd articulated something many of them had felt but never named. And after the dinner, 17 farmers approached him, some with questions, some just to shake his hand, and Rick stood off to the side watching, thinking about how 8 months earlier he'd laughed when Bill said he wanted to check his balance, and now that same man was the most respected person in the room. And as winter turned to spring again, Bill's new equipment arrived, massive, machines delivered to a farm that hadn't changed in nearly half a century. And when Rick stopped by later to see how things were going, Bill told him something that surprised him again, that the new equipment hadn't increased yields, that the corn didn't care whether it was planted by a 1979 International or a brand new John Deere, that the real value wasn't in making more money, but in making the work easier and faster, finishing planting in 3 days instead of 7, harvesting in 4 instead of 9. And at 72, Bill said that difference mattered. And when someone asked him if he regretted waiting so long to upgrade, Bill shook his head and said no, because waiting allowed him to buy everything cash, because if he'd upgraded 20 years earlier, he would have financed it and paid interest and stress for decades. And by waiting, he believed he'd saved close to $1 million, and that patience, more than any market timing or yield bump, had paid him back. And when Rick asked him what he planned to do with the remaining wealth he hadn't spent, Bill said he was leaving it to his children and grandchildren, but with conditions, that they would only receive it once they proved they could save money themselves, because he didn't want to hand millions to people who hadn't learned discipline. And if they never did, he said calmly, the money would go to charity, because he'd rather help strangers who worked hard than family who wasted it. And that decision alone motivated his children, all in their 40s, to start saving more aggressively than they ever had before. And when people asked Bill how he lived on $20,000 a year, he didn't defend it or romanticize it. He just explained, no mortgage, modest taxes, simple food cooked at home, old clothes worn until they wore out, an old truck that ran fine, basic health care, free entertainment from the library and community, and no interest in chasing comfort for its own sake. And when someone said that sounded miserable, Bill smiled slightly and said he had everything he needed: house, food, health, family, and freedom. And that contentment was something modern society had forgotten how to value. And Rick carried that word with him, contentment, because it explained so much of what he'd seen over the years. Why so many people with high incomes still felt anxious. Why growth never seemed to satisfy. Why success always needed to look bigger than it felt. And one evening, sitting alone in his office after closing, Rick compared to lives on paper. The average farmer in his area, expanded acreage, financed equipment, millions in debt, constant stress, and Bill Henderson, 420 acres. No expansion, no debt for decades, lower gross income but far higher net worth and zero pressure. And the difference wasn't intelligence or opportunity, it was patience. And Rick saw clearly now that selling more wasn't always better, that pushing growth without ownership destroyed more farmers than it helped. And he adjusted his business accordingly, even knowing it would cost him personally. Because when he recalculated his own life, the boats, the trucks, the vacations, the easy spending, he realized he'd made good money for 32 years but had very little to show for it in terms of true security. And inspired by Bill, Rick changed, cut his own spending drastically, began saving aggressively, and for the first time in his life, felt the quiet relief that came with watching numbers grow instead of disappear. And by the end of the year, Patterson John Deere's revenue was down, but customer satisfaction was up, bad debt was down sharply, retention was up, referrals were up, and Rick's stress level was lower than it had ever been. And when a local reporter interviewed Bill later that year and asked what advice he'd give young farmers starting out, Bill didn't hesitate. He said getting rich farming was simple but hard. Simple because the formula was obvious. Spend less than you earn, save the difference, avoid debt. Hard because it required decades of discipline and the willingness to look unsuccessful for a long time. And he warned that starting big, financing everything, and looking impressive early was building on sand, that one bad year could wipe it all out, while starting small and owning what you had built on bedrock. And he ended by saying winning at 70 was better than losing at 40. And the article drew thousands of comments, some calling the advice outdated, others calling it the only truth that mattered. And Rick noticed something telling. The people who dismissed it were usually the ones buried in debt, while the ones who listened quietly started saving. And when Rick thought back to that Monday morning, to the laugh that slipped out of him when Bill said he wanted to check his balance, he felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude, because that laugh had exposed a blind spot he didn't know he had. And Bill Henderson, the farmer who looked poorest, turned out to be the richest man in the room, not just in money, but in freedom. And the lesson that remained, the one people repeated, the one that stuck, was simple and uncomfortable: never judge a farmer by his truck, judge him by his balance, because appearances lie. Discipline compounds quietly, and the people who win in the end are often the ones no one was watching along the way.